Hello again and welcome to Eye on Opticom, a podcast from Global Traffic Technologies that brings you insightful conversations from around the law enforcement, public safety, and transit industries. Our guest on today's episode is Captain Don Redmond with the Police Department in Chula Vista, California. He's responsible for special projects at the department and led an initiative with the CVPD, GTT, and Motorola last year to launch a pilot program that would have the department be the first law enforcement agency in the country to deploy a new cloud-hosted, incident-based priority control solution from Opticom. Don, thanks for taking some time to talk to us today.
Thank you for having me.
How did the idea of this pilot program with GTT come up?
Well, it was interesting at the time, probably a couple of years ago, our city is part of the Smart Cities initiative, and our fire department had the Opticom system, the GPS with the equipment on the vehicles, and they invited me into a meeting with GTT and the fire department, some city officials, and at the time I oversaw our fleet division for the police department. At the time, we had about 250 officers. So we probably have about 60 patrol vehicles. And they brought me into the meeting and asked, kind of explained, at the time I didn't know what Opticom was. They explained about the green light preemption and that the fire department had it, and there's some benefits for MTS buses to have it and all of these great benefits. And I was sold on it immediately until they told me that the equipment would need to go into the vehicles. And I explained, well, with the equipment going into the vehicles, fire department's not a big deal, but with 60 cars, and we usually crash our cars the day we get them. We would constantly be moving this equipment in and out of cars constantly, and I really didn't want that to happen. They also explained how the Opticom system for fire department is when you turn your lights and sirens on, that's what turns on the preemption. And I explained for most law enforcement, we don't drive lights and sirens to all of our calls for service. It's very rarely that we do so. The idea of having it at a preemption with just our lights and sirens wasn't going to work for us. So in our discussions with the technicians, I said, well, if it's GPS based and our MDCs, our computers in the cars are GPS based, could we run everything through our Motorola or CAD system? So when an officer gets a priority call for service, and that officer hits the en route button on their computer, that would turn on the preemption remotely, and then the officer could go to the call, getting green lights without lights and siren, without any kind of manipulation in the vehicle, no switches, no equipment inside the vehicle. Everything would be CAD based.
And we'll explore CAD integration and incident-based preemption in a bit. But first, just in general, the CVPD has a reputation as one of the most progressive, forward-thinking departments in the country when it comes to embracing technology. How does the department view technology in terms of how it can help with policing?
So we've been very fortunate, and we've had a lot of innovators within our department, whether it's our IT personnel or just we've had some lieutenants and captains who've really been a futurist in the way they view technology and how technology could be used for good for the community. And with that, we have an outstanding police chief in Roxana Kennedy, who has been very supportive in all of our technology initiatives. And then additionally, you can't just do it without the support of the community. So being really transparent in everything that we do and how we use technology, and being transparent and sharing that with the community before we implement this new technology, and so that they're aware of it, has been really open doors for us to continue using technologies in new and innovative ways.
Okay, now let's talk about some of the specifics of the solution itself. What triggers preemption within the vehicle?
Yeah, so that's really the magic of the beta that we're working with GTT on, in that the preemption has nothing to do with an officer inside the patrol car. The officer does not do anything to get the green light preemption. Everything is through the CAD based. Because when you have an officer responding to an emergency, we don't want them having to, touch buttons and, flip switches to get green lights and all these other things. We want them focused on hearing the updates and having a game plan when they arrive on scene.
What is incident-based preemption then, and how is it unique from regular emergency vehicle preemption?
So the fire department, when they go with lights and sirens. They turn on a switch to turn on their lights and sirens. And when they do that, that turns on the preemption for equipment inside their fire trucks to go to the call to turn the green light on. We wanted to look differently and to make it an incident-based preemption in that there's no manipulation inside the patrol vehicle to get the green lights to turn on. Everything is done at the police department, essentially through the CAD system. So a dispatcher gets an emergency call. They enter the information into computer-aided dispatch, which we call CAD, which is the computer. It's kind of the brains of law enforcement. And from there is where we dispatch officers from. So a dispatcher will see that it's a priority emergency, and then they send that call for service to the officer in the field via their computer or their MDC. When the officer gets that call for service, when they push the button that they're en route, that's what turns on the preemption automatically. Nothing that the officer does and nothing that the dispatcher does turns it on. It's just all integrated into the CAD.
And it sounds like having incident-based preemption was one of the keys to moving this pilot program forward.
Absolutely. We made it very clear right from the start that two things. One, we wanted zero equipment in the police car. The police cars already are packed full of equipment. I didn't want taking vehicles out of service to add equipment to it or remove them, constantly shifting, when a new car comes in, taking the equipment out of the old car and shifting to the new one. So I said, we don't want any equipment in there. And then the second part is we want it to be automatic. We want these green light preemptions to be automatic under certain circumstances so that a dispatcher or an officer doesn't even have to think about it. It occurs automatically depending on the type of call that they're responding to.
That lack of hardware must be one of the most appealing aspects of having a centralized solution then.
Absolutely, because, well, one, ideally, we would think with no hardware inside the vehicle, there's a cost savings that you don't have to actually physically purchase the equipment. And then there's manpower hours that you don't have to spend to have that person putting the equipment inside the vehicle and then ultimately removing it. And, having that system interact with our other systems was also a concern.
What were the main pain points that Opticom Priority Control was intended to address?
If you call the police department, it's usually not a good time for you. You never call the police department because you're having a good day. It's usually one of the worst days of your life. When you do call the police department, it's an emergency. Majority of the time, it's always going to be an emergency. You want us there as quickly as possible. And with the green light preemption, it's frustrating for officers when they're responding to an emergency. And like I said, we typically don't go lights and sirens, but you just sit at a red light for a minute or so and then go to another block and sit at another red light, knowing that there's somebody who's waiting for you. There's an emergency happening. It can be frustrating for not only the officer, but obviously the person who needs our help. So the green light preemption gets us there minutes quicker. And do 2 or 3 minutes make a difference to you if it's an emergency? I would say it would, absolutely.
Yeah, no question about it. These projects are never done in a vacuum. To what extent has your traffic engineering department been involved in the project, and what have they thought of it?
So we brought them in immediately right from the beginning because you have to involve your traffic engineering, right? Because they control the intersections and they understand how the intersections work, which equipment is in there, what is going to be needed as we unroll this beta test and kind of go to production on it. We want to make sure that everybody who is involved in this in the city understands the project and how it's going to relate to the other Opticom systems within the city, whether it's the fire department, what happens if you have people crossing the streets and the crosswalks, how is that going to work? So bringing them on board in the initial conversations was imperative.
What concerns, if any, did they have about the pilot, and how did you address those concerns?
Their number one concerns, as ours, is safety of the community. We want to make sure that what we're doing is safe. So, the ideas of, well, what if you have a fire truck running one direction and a police car with a preemption running the other direction? who is going to get the green light preemption? Is it going to change the pattern signals? Is it going to impact traffic? What about citizens crossing in the crossing walks? How are all of these questions, because their focus is to make sure every intersection within the city is safe. So having them there, and for us to understand how the signals work, because we're police officers, we're not engineers, and then bringing the GTT technicians in with the traffic engineering and our police department, and as to what our vision is, was really imperative to get this project off the ground.
Where does the project stand at the moment?
So we did the initial stages where we actually put equipment in the car, and then sent a test call for service to our CAD, which turned on the equipment within the vehicle. And as we went to the intersection, it recognized the approaching vehicle and turned the light green. So that was the very initial step. So now we're moving into the second phase, still putting some modems in the car and a few test vehicles for the test phase of the preemption coming through CAD. Would turn on the modems within the vehicle, and then the final stage is to remove those modems out of the vehicles for the final test to make sure that there's no equipment in the car. So the modems being put into a few test vehicles is the next step.
You've talked about this pilot program a little bit nationally. What has the response been from other law enforcement agencies?
They're amazed. They just shake their heads like, how are you guys doing these things? Because we've done a number of first initiatives in the country for a lot of different technologies, and they keep asking us, like, where are you coming up with these ideas? Once you start understanding technology and how it can be used, it really opens up, it kind of pulls the curtain back as to what the future could be like, not just for law enforcement, but for the community, how much safer, how much more efficient that we could be. And we're constantly having agencies reach out to us, picking our brains as to what they could do to make their communities even safer.
I mean, it's really just been the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how technology can impact and help policing.
Oh, absolutely. We have a lot of initiatives that we've undertaken here, and GTT is just the latest.
There seems to be a perception in some corners of the country that preemption is just a tool for fire and ambulances. Why do you think that perception exists?
I think a big part of it is cost was always a factor for police departments, at least, and I can't speak for all police departments, but fire departments buy fire trucks that are $100,000. I'm just kind of guessing here, and they keep those fire trucks for 10 years. So putting equipment in those vehicles is cost effective. There's no issue with them putting that equipment in there. We buy a police car and we crash it the day we get it, right? Because we're always breaking down cars and everything else, and we have a much larger fleet. So the cost for us to bring on the Opticom system, like the fire department, was really cost prohibitive to some extent for just the equipment entering into all of the vehicles. And then you add the fact that the fire department and the ambulances that are responding, they're turning on the Opticom system and they're turning it off within the vehicle. We didn't want that to happen for the officers. We wanted the officers focused on just their response, having their game plan, listening to the updates. And we don't go lights and sirens to our emergencies. We go to a lot of emergencies with no lights and sirens, but there's still an impact on how long it takes us to get there. So we wanted to address that. And we also wanted to make it safer. Ultimately, we do see the need because, you see those in the news all the time that first responders get into traffic collisions with community members when they're going through intersections, maybe without lights and sirens. They're just trying to rush to get there. And unfortunately, a traffic collision occurs in the intersection. We see the importance of it, but once we can overcome the cost and the equipment issue, I think it's going to open the door for a lot more agencies to get on board with the Opticom.
How has the project been supported locally?
I think everybody is cautiously excited about it. My chief asks about it all the time. Response times are something that we always track. We try and get there under a certain amount of time, and the other part of it is safety for the community. Anything that we can implement that is safer for our officers in the community, and that is, going through intersections during emergency is always a critical time. everybody's excited, and we're really excited to get the next phase of the beta test up and running and to see what happens. I tested the first go through on the beta test, and I have to tell you, when you're 3:00 in the afternoon going down one of the busiest streets in the city and seeing all of the red lights start turning green as you're approaching them, you really see the benefits immediately of how this is going to be a game changer for law enforcement.
How has GTT been to work with as a partner during this process?
Outstanding. And I'm not just saying that because we're on the podcast here. Everybody who's been involved in this process with from GTT has been outstanding. We work with a lot of different vendors, and I have to say GTT is one of the top in just their personnel, their responsiveness, just understanding our vision. Not saying no immediately when we say we want this, and then they go back and try and work it out. And that's a big part of innovation and technology. If you've got a vendor that says no, we can't do that, then we're never going to move it forward. And GTT at no point ever said no, we can't do that. There were times where they paused and kind of had to scratch their heads and like, I think we can make this happen. And that really goes to the expertise and the technical abilities that GTT personnel have.
Well, Captain Redmond, we know you have a busy schedule, so we'll let you get back to it. Thanks again for coming on the podcast today to share your story with us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
That was Captain Don Redmond with the Police Department in Chula Vista, California, detailing the pilot program they developed with GTT and Motorola around CAD integration and incident-based preemption. Thanks for downloading today's episode. Until next time, I'm Bill Hupp, and this has been Eye on Opticom.